Blog Talk Radio.
Hey, this is Sean Dutton from PreparedTimesMagazine.com, and we're talking to Rob Chilcote. He's the president of the board for the Kingman Air Museum in Kingman, Arizona. It's actually the Kingman Army Airfield Museum. We're going to be broadcasting live for the next hour from the museum. We're actually inside the museum talking to Rob. He's going to tell us a little bit about the history of Kingman, how the museum ended up here, what the airfield was all about, and, you know, we'll go from there and just play it by ear and see what happens. So can you hear me, Rob?
Yes, I can.
Okay, why don't you tell us a little bit about Kingman itself before the airfield was here and how the airfield ended up here?
Well, Kingman started out as a railroad town because it was a part of the siting of the Atlantic and Pacific Railroad when it came through the 35th parallel. So it was just another train stop on the railroad. And it became a cattle town. It became a mining town. As progress progressed, the technology changed, and then aviation became part of the town.
So then the Army showed up one day and decided to put in a Army airfield, or is that what happened?
Well, let's just go back just a little bit, because in 1929, Charles Lindbergh came through here and set up the transcontinental air transport system, and Kingman happened to be one of the locations that he liked. So people are related to Lindbergh to Kingman Army Airfield, which is just sort of like an urban legend. But he created the first airport in Kingman. So when the war finally came around for World War II, the citizens here started looking at, let's contact the government and tell them we're a perfect position to have a military base. Not only having the rail lines, we also had Route 66 driving through here. And Route 66 was started in 1926. Basically, it was a dirt road until the late 30s when it finally became paved.
So then on about May 27, 1943, the facility was officially named the Kingman Army Airfield, and the Army started showing up?
Well, actually, we can go back to 1940. The Mojave County Chamber of Commerce started sending out letters to government officials, even like to President Roosevelt. And then they kept doing it every year until probably 1942, after we entered the war. Then we started seeing more action from the Army Air Force, and they sent representatives over here. They wanted to buy land. They wanted to make sure the land was easy to access. Especially, they picked this place because it was farther outside of town. It was about 15 miles outside of town at one time, because Kingman was a very small town of 3,000 population in 1940. So from what I've done in other researches of other facilities, the military wanted places out in the middle of nowhere. That way they could run their programs and train people to get them ready for the war and send them over to the European theater or to the Pacific theater. Kingman was actually started in the summer of 1942, but it never became official until May of 43.
So when the Army Airfield opened, how were I guess you'd call them Army airmen, how were they arriving in Kingman? Were they coming by train, plane, and automobile, and then Kingman, they really boosted the Kingman area and it started growing, or what happened?
I think they probably came mainly by the rail, but there was let me go back one more step. The main base that helps supply men for the airfield came from Las Vegas, from the Las Vegas Gunnery School. That was the parent base. And they sent down the base headquarters team, and there was about 40 to 50 people in that. And then they set up gunnery training squadrons there, and they sent them to Kingman. The gunnery training squadrons is what was going to train the troops here on how to be a gunner. So they were the instructors already trained at the Las Vegas Gunnery School. And then, I need to go. So they came here, then a few more groups come from other places, then they would use the trains or they would be flown in. That's if the runways were ready. But I think the runways weren't done until late part of December.
So they actually graduated about 35,000 gunnery school people from this airfield itself?
Well, actually, it's a little over 36,000. Basically, what they did is the first classes started in January 43. And it was usually 15 to 20 guys in the class because a lot of them weren't being shipped in yet because Kingman was just still being built up. By the end of 43, I would say there was already 200 guys in a class learning. So it stayed that way pretty much through till the end of the war, especially when Europe finally surrendered in May of 45, then it started slowing down. The few classes that were left at the end of the summer of 45 were transferred to other bases. So basically by the end of July or the early part of August 45, there was no more gunnery training here.
Okay, and as some of the classes that the air gunnery people took when they came here was the Waller training. Could you tell us a bit about what that was?
Well, let's now that's a good question. So what the guys had to do in their 6 weeks of training is like 2 weeks they were in a classroom. So this is one of those classrooms that they would be in. And then 2 weeks they'd be over at the ground-to-ground learning how to shoot any kind of weapon that they wanted to use. It was like BB guns, 22s, Thompsons, and up to the 50 cal machine gun. And then 2 weeks they would be flying around shooting live rounds. They would shoot gun camera. Towards the end of the war, they were using what they called a fraggable bullet. What the fraggable bullet did was, as soon as you hit the plane with that bullet, it would break in two because it would not pierce the skin of the aircraft. So it was like early paintball. Now let's go back to the Waller trainer. What was neat about the Waller trainer is that it had like 4 positions, and they would show film on the other side of the room. So you would learn how to track the aircraft with your guns. So in a way, it's an early version of games, like computerized games. So it's back then. These are state of art techniques that they're using to train the troops or the gunnery students on how to be better gunners.
So this was all going on about 1943. They started the training, and they also had an oxygen chamber that they trained in. They did class on aircraft identification, how to repair turrets, the gun turrets in the airplanes. Some of the other classes they prepared for gave a class on preparation for a mission, range estimation course, the moving base, the turret drill, the malfunctions class, and then another thing it says here is that they had a skeet range that the students would fire a shotgun, and they had to do this before they were actually allowed to use the machine guns?
Yes. Well, let's look at the malfunction range. I just got to meet a gentleman the other day that was an instructor out here. He's 88 years old. He lives in Texas, and he was telling me that that's what his job was in instructing, was telling the students how to clear a weapon if it got jammed. So basically, that was probably a couple-hour class. It's not too extensive because once you clear your weapon, then it's ready to go back to firing. But like the turret training, that started in the classroom, and it went all the way through the flying. They had to learn how to shoot from the turret, and there's two turrets in the B-17. There's the upper turret, which you have to stand up, and then there's the belly turret, and you're sitting in a little ball, and you're just shooting away. Then the other positions on the B-17 was the tail gunner. The nose gunner usually was an officer, and then you had two waist gunners. The waist gunners had probably the best room because they're in the middle of the aircraft with where there's not a lot of weapons or anything except for the two guns that are going outside the waist. Now, ski training was an excellent way for the guys to learn how to track an object, because it's just basic training so that when they get with the 50 cal, they would understand how to track the Messerschmitts that would be coming after them when they were flying over Europe.
So basically the entire training was being done at other bases before they started utilizing Kingman as a gunnery base. You said there was a base up in Las Vegas or something they started at and came here?
Right. The Las Vegas base was started probably just after the war started in Europe, and they were looking for a nice big open area, and Nevada had it. But they were also looking for other places, and Kingman became the sixth largest gunnery training base in the war. So because we had two air-to-air fields, one was ranch land, and the southern part was all BLM. So that was easy land to get a hold of because the government owned it.
And in the oxygen chamber, they actually simulated what it would be like to fly at 38,000 feet without leaving the ground.
Right. Yeah, especially on B-17 missions over Europe, they had to wear oxygen masks because they were going to be flying at 30,000. Because most cabins have to be pressurized around 14,000. So yeah, they had to have some kind of training in how to use their masks. So the altitude squadron was a perfect example of that.
And then on the range estimation course, there's some notes here that say on final exam day, the gunner estimates without the aid of a pilot's earphone, you'd have to estimate the range of aircraft coming in and things like that.
Right. Basically what it was is it's just another tool that they used after they got done using the skeet range, and then that way they can go to the 50 cal and then shoot some more live rounds here and there. Because the ground-to-ground had about 4 stages. One of them was the skeet shooting. Then they had the turret where they were actually in a movable turret so they can get the feel of what the guns would feel like if it was in the aircraft. And then they would shoot at remote-controlled vehicles that would have a target on it. So it's very technical for all that.
And they also had some parachute training and parachutes here at the base that they had to prepare themselves and take with them?
Right. Most air crew, when they would fly, they would have a parachute with them because you never know when the aircraft might have a problem and you got to bail out. But the one thing about the whole facility is that they had at least 5 auxiliary airfield areas where if they were having problems, they could land the plane and get out of it, wait for maintenance to come and fix the problem. And then they would be transported back to base.
Now, the B-17 was the main plane that they trained in, but they also had other planes that they trained gunners in?
Well, at the start of the training, the way that they earned their wings is they shot a 30 cal out off the back of the cockpit of a AT-6. And that's how they got started. Well, when you only have 15 to 20 students a class, it's pretty easy to do it. But when you start getting up to 200, 300, you're going to have to put them in a bigger airplane. And by the summer, I would say by the summer of '43, they finally had some B-17s here. So they were using the B-17 a lot. They had, of course, the B-13 here. They had a couple of other planes. They also used like a TB-26 for the co-pilot training. But all that TB-26 did was pull stow targets.
Okay, it's for the people that don't know what a B-17 is that like the Memphis Belle and the Enola Gay and planes like that?
So the Memphis Belle is the perfect example of that. The Enola Gay was a B-29, so it's a lot huger aircraft.
Okay, so the Memphis Belle was a B-17?
Yes. And the Memphis Belle did make a visit here to the base after they did their 25 successful missions.
So when they trained as a gun crew, did they get stationed as a gun crew, or they got stationed individually all over the world? Did they stay together as a crew?
I believe that they got transferred separately. They would go to different crews. Sometimes some guys probably went together in one crew, but I would say maybe 2 or 3 at a time. But most of the time they just sent them over to Europe, and then they would get their final orders in Europe, and then they would go to their respective flight crews.
So when you trained as a gunner, you could be a turret gunner or a tail gunner. It didn't matter. You were a gunner's a gunner, and you could be assigned any position, or did you specifically train for a tail gunner or the turret gunner position?
Well, from what I've seen of all the documentation, they were trained for every position. Usually a tall guy wasn't going to get trained for the ball turret, but he needed to know how to work the ball turret. Same as the upper turret. You're not going to put a short guy there because he's not going to be able to see the aircraft and track them. So he still need to know how to use the upper turret. So everybody would be placed into their position when they got to their flight crew.
And they actually had a class of Chinese officers came down here and trained for gunners?
Oh, yes. That's actually a good subject matter because since I was talking about the trains earlier, we know that the Chinese helped build the railroads throughout the United States. But sometime in the late 1800s, there was a law passed that no more Chinese could come into this country. And it wasn't until 1943 when the law was repealed, so that these Chinese officers and enlisted men could come here and actually train in the United States.
And then they trained for a B-17. The Chinese, we actually gave them B-17s that a whole Chinese crew would be in, or they were just gunners in the back?
I think they were sold a couple of B-17s, so some of these guys would have been part of the B-17s that were over there. But chances are they may just been trained on how to use the guns, and they could go to another aircraft that had guns.
So as part of the B-17 crew, you have the pilot, the co-pilot, probably a bombardier, a navigator, and then the gun crew. Is that about how it's set up, or?
Yeah, and you probably, one of the gun crew could also be the radio guy, the radio operator. But chances are that could have been a separate position. So there was at least 10 men per crew. So you would have your 4 officers, which would be the main flight crew, and then you have your 6 gunners, which would be the support crew.
And then another class that they taught here at the school was a class in aircraft identification. And since it was a world war, were they trying to identify, Japanese aircraft, German aircraft, French aircraft? That seems like it'd be a big class all by itself.
I would say that was probably a couple-hour class, and then they would refresh the guys along the way. They needed to know what the German aircraft looked like. They needed to know what the Italian aircraft looked like. They needed to know what the Japanese aircraft looked like. like. And then, of course, they needed to know what our own aircraft looked like, because you don't want to be shooting down your own aircraft. So you need to make sure you know what was in the air and what was coming after you. So basically, it's kind of like you need to know if it's a friend or a foe.
Was there an average age of the gunmen or the gunners that were showing up at this class? Were they like 18, 19, or were they older, or just a whole different variety of age ranges?
I would say for the start, they were probably 18, 19 years old, because a lot of your flight officers on some of those were the same age. They were 19, 20, because they've already had some college education, and they were also already had some flight, and they were able to become pilots. So the gunners would be almost the same ages. So, yeah, I would say that's it. That's true.
One thing that people probably don't realize is that besides the Air Force, the Army has its own Air Force, the Marines has its own Air Force, and the Navy has its own Air Force within the different branches. And what we're talking about here is the Kingman Army Airfield Museum. You can Google it and find their website. They have a new website up. It's http://main.kingman.aafhsmuseum.org, or you can go to Prepared Times Magazine, and we'll have a link up to them tonight. And also, we're going to be on the Dr. Prepper Show tonight as a rebroadcast for those people that are listening on Dr. Prepper. It's part of the Prepared Times Magazine. It's also part of the Prepared Radio Network that Dr. Prepper is setting up. So basically, they also had a mascot. They brought in Bugs Bunny as part of their mascot and put some weapons and stuff with him.
Yes, actually, this is probably one of my favorite stories to tell, because after I started doing research on the airfield, I became part of the reunions, and sometime in 92, possibly 93, I was contacted by an individual that was stationed here, and this individual was in the publication department. And what was kind of neat about this guy was he was an animator for Warner Brothers. He worked for Leon Schlesinger, which was the producer at the time that was controlling Bugs Bunny. And this animator knew Leon. So when they were looking at trying to get a hold of a mascot for here, he made contact with Leon and got permission to use Bugs Bunny. Now, besides telling me that part, he said also there was a animator here from Walt Disney, except this guy didn't know Walt Disney well enough, so if it wasn't Bugs Bunny, it could have been Mickey Mouse.
Okay, and there was, I think they call them murals they put on the planes. There was a lot of Bugs Bunny murals put on some airplanes and things like that. So, they actually didn't train in the B-17s that they took over to the European theater. Those planes were already over there. They trained here and went over there, and then how did they end up getting the murals put on the planes from the different gunners that went over there? The
B-17s that were here stayed here. They were part of the training. Now, if these guys were being assigned to a flight crew here in the States, they would meet the 17 that they would be assigned to, like in the East Coast area, and then they would be shipped over by transport on a ship, or sometimes they would actually fly their B-17 across the Atlantic. Now, the murals that you're talking about is nose art, and quite a few B-17s had nose art, and so did the 24s, the 25s, and the 26s, the 39s and 38s, the P-51s. They also had nose art. Nose art was just another way of bringing something home with them. That way, they had home there. And they would use cartoon characters. They would use women. They would use spooky characters, whatever, to create those nose arts.
I was reading in some of the notes here, they also had something called a Yucca sub-base. Was that part of this, or that's part of something else?
No, actually, the Yucca sub-base was just another version of Kingman Army Airfield. Eventually, they just called it Yucca Army Airfield. And it's about 25 miles west of Kingman on I-40. And the place was just a small version of Kingman, like I said. Basically, it had some training there, but it was mainly the air-to-air because just south of it was the BLM land. And that's the area that they would use for air-to-air. So the B-17 crew would go up with some trainees in it, and then some of the aircraft would come in and practice like they were attacking it. So that's how the air-to-air facility was used.
Now we're broadcasting live from the Kingman Army Airfield Museum in Kingman, Arizona. It's still on Route 66. I guess it's the original Route 66. When you pull into the airport here at Kingman, the first thing you see is a big tower, an old tower, but it's not in use. Was that part of the Kingman Army Airfield Museum?
No, it isn't. It's just it's a building that's on the National Historic Registry. It's been there about 10 years, I think, within the last 10 years, maybe even longer. That tower was slated to go to one of the forests in New Mexico around the Roswell area, and the Army Air Corps or the Army Air Force needed a tower, so they sent it here and they put it up. Now, while the runways were being used, they had a mobile tower system. They've just put it in the back of a big truck, and the guys that were controlling the airspace around Kingman would talk the pilots into giving clearance, letting them know that they could take off. And then once the tower was established, they had all the equipment that they needed to do their launching of the aircraft and receiving. And they also received aircraft that would come through the area on their way to the East Coast or the West Coast.
So the actual hangar that we're in right now, which is the Kingman Army Airfield Museum in Kingman, Arizona, this hangar here was around when the gunners were here, and what was it used for back then?
Yes, this building wasn't really set up as a hangar until 30-some-odd years ago. This building was known as the Base Engineering Building, and it also housed the machine shop. So, yeah, it was never really used for any kind of training. It was just used for maintenance of the base.
And you have some actual trucks, and what's some of the stuff you have here inside the museum that people would find really interesting from back in when the gunnery school was here?
Well, we got a lot of photos of what went on here, and we have an actual shotgun that was used in the skeet range. It was bought by the sheriff's office after the war because it was surplus, and I'm just amazed that we have it today because sheriff's office, they sometimes give their shotguns away to a prized employee for their retirement, so that way they can have a piece of their sheriff's office days. The other thing is we have a can opener, which is known as the Jaws of Life. This thing would be used in case an aircraft would crash and you had to cut out the crew. Also, it was used during the salvage days when Storage Depot 41 was established after the war. They would use it after the guillotine, couldn't cut through a few things. They just used it to cut bigger pieces into smaller pieces so that it could be melted down into aluminum ingots. What else? Oh, yeah, we got a great map of the area showing the air-to-air, ground-to-ground, where the bases were, where the auxiliary airfields were. And
you have patches and details for sale. you have a gift shop here in the hangar. What's the hour? What days is the hangar open and closed on?
Well, we're open from Tuesday to Saturday, from 10 to 3, during those days. If you call us, you can also set up an appointment for Sunday or Monday.
There's also some military vehicles outside the hangar that look like they're pretty old, and there's some military vehicles inside the hangar that look pretty old. Were those part of the gunnery class that was here?
No, I would say they're from a couple of different eras. Now, the truck that we have inside is an actual scout or reconnaissance vehicle. So it would actually be used by maybe an armored division or infantry division to go out and scout ahead of the troops so that they can see what the enemy was doing. Now, that's a pretty huge vehicle, and it's all armor-plated. Now, the trucks outside are maybe not quite World War II. They could be more like Vietnam-era vehicles, and they've just been donated to the museum to put on display.
And you also have some, looks like research or test vehicles and kit-type airplanes that you have inside the hangar?
Well, we have 2 World War I kit planes. They're 7th, 8th scale, and they used to fly because I remember seeing them back in the 90s during the reunions. But we do have a half-scale Corsair, which is a gorgeous kit plane. This guy took his time building it, and he got to fly it a few times. And then we have a BD-5, which is never really flown, but it's just a nice little display to get the kids interested in aviation.
And you also have one of the helicopters that looked like it was from what you see in the MASH units and things like that, but this is more of a police-type helicopter you have here?
Actually, this is a Bell 47. It was built in 1947, and the serial number is 1956. So it's one of the first of that type. But this style of helicopter was used in Korea. Now, this helicopter was used by the California Highway Patrol, but before we got it, for about 15 to 20 years, it was used in a aviation school as a training to work on the engines and the controls. So it hasn't really flown in probably the last 30 years.
And you have a big red double wing, looks like an old airplane like the Red Baron would have flown or something like that?
Right. That's the World War I that I spoke of earlier, being it's a Fokker, but I'm still trying to figure out which model it is. And then we also have a Newport. And these are the 2 planes that I said I saw fly around back in the 90s.
And then you have I noticed a room that has some uniforms in it, and you have 2 display cases with little model airplanes that people put together. Who put those together?
I couldn't really tell you who put those models together, but the uniforms that you were talking about in the smaller display room, those are pretty much current uniforms. Some of them probably go back to Vietnam. I don't think we have any old. I know we've got a few uniforms from World War II, but most everything that we've been receiving through donations are probably Vietnam era.
In about 1945, when the war ended, there was no longer a need for a gunnery school. But I've seen some pictures around the museum where it looks like there was thousands and thousands of planes being stored here, and then in 1946 the base became a storage depot.
Yeah, before it became a storage depot, after the war pretty much ended in September, October, November, December, a lot of bombers that were over in the European theater were flown here. Basically the B-24s and B-17s. There was about 4,000 of them that came here. There was 5,600 aircraft that was all total here. And most of them met their death here And I get people asking me why destroy so many aircraft. Well, most of these aircraft had already 30 missions to 60 missions on them. So they're pretty well shot up. It would take too much money to try to refurbish them. So most of them would come here and be dismantled. They would take out whatever critical components that they wanted, and then everything else would be chopped up and melted down to an aluminum ingot. And the company that won the bid for it was named Wunderlich. They were out of Missouri, and I think they paid like $2 million, maybe $3 million for the whole lot. And once they won the bid, they had less than 18 months to chop them all up and melt them down from that time they won the bid. And I think they won the bid in the summer of 46. So by the summer of 47, pretty much all the aircraft were gone. And I think they only sold about 6 aircraft from here. 5 of them were AD-6s, and 1 was a BT-13. So nobody bought a bomber.
Okay, and it says about July 1948, the military released the base for civilian use, and it became a property of the Mojave County?
Yes, it did. And it stayed property of Mojave County until sometime in the 80s when it was transferred to the city of Kingman. So it's now the airfield's now under the auspices of the Kingman Airport Authority, which is a contractor to the city of Kingman.
And then we're talking with Rob Chilcote of the Kingman Army Airfield Museum in Kingman, Arizona, giving a little history of the museum that's here in the Gunnery School. He's president of the board, a new organization that took over the Army Airfield Museum. How did you come about taking over the museum again, Rob?
Give me a moment. I had to get a drink of water.
All right.
What was the question again?
How did your organization actually end up taking control of the museum at this time? It looks like it's changed hands a few times, and you know it might change hands again and again and again. But how does a person go about getting a museum like this and taking it over?
Well, basically, the Kingman Army Airfield Historical Society is the second version of the museum group. The first museum group started about 1988, and the lady that kind of got it started was Mary Ellen Montgomery. She had the local FBO here, which is a fixed base operation. And at this office, guys would show up telling her stories about being stationed here. And she goes, the idea finally came to her that there should be a museum out here. And then eventually she started finding people that were in town that had the same mindset to create a museum. So the first museum was known as the Kingman Army Airfield Museum Pursuit. And that lasted until the Kingman Army Airfield Historical Society merged with them and took over. Now, the Kingman Historical Society, the Airfield Society itself, started out as unions, which started back in the 1990s. I think the first reunion was 1991, which I was not part of. But from 92 on, I was part of the unions. And we held reunions for the guys that would come back. And I got to meet quite a few of the guys. And since we haven't talked about the celebrities of Kingman Army Airfield, I think it's time that we talked about one of them. Because I did ask a few of the guys that were stationed here what they thought about him. Charles Bronson was stationed here. He was part of the kitchen. He drove truck, and most of the guys kind of did meet him, and he was kind of standoffish. And their main I'm trying to think of the term, but their main idea of him was that he was pretty lazy. He just wasn't really into the war effort. But after Kingman started slowing down, he was able to transfer out of here, and he became a B-29 gunner so he flew over Europe, Japan a couple of times. So he did make a few missions over Japan, and that's one thing that I haven't been able to research really well, is trying to find his military record. Because for some reason, whatever bio I've seen, he doesn't really speak highly of his military days.
So besides Charles Bronson, I understand that Colonel Harvey Hugland was the commanding officer of the Kingman Army Airfield?
Yes, he was the first one. He was assigned from Las Vegas Gunnery School, because that was his duty station before he came here. And I would say on base commanders, there was like 6 or 7 here, because the last one before it got transferred to the WWA, which is the War Assets Administration. The last guy, I believe, was Lance Call, and he was a lieutenant colonel. So at one time there was a couple of colonels, but beginning and ending, they were lieutenant colonels. Basically, they were temporary guys anyway. They wanted a colonel running the airfield.
So besides Charles Bronson, do you know any other celebrities that passed through here? I know Bob Hope did some shows here. I think he did anyway.
Which guy? Oh, Bob Hope? Yeah, Bob Hope made a visit here one time. He was here for pretty much a full day. He did a USO show in the afternoon, and then later on he had another show just to entertain the troops a certain way. But he was big on USO back then. He was Mr. USO. So it was neat to know that Bob Hope came here. Besides that, we had also the Three Stooges. They came for a couple hours. Also, the USO show had a few people that would come in. I think Kay Kaiser came twice. He came the first time with Bob, and then he came another time to entertain the troops. He had brought his own band. And I think there was another time he came here and he used the bass band to entertain the troops. And then the other big celebrity that we had out here was the Lone Ranger, Clayton Moore. And he was trained here for 6 weeks as a gunner, but he never stayed on base. He lived off base. He lived in Kingman. And I think because he was already a celebrity, they didn't want him to really get used to being on the base lifestyle. So he lived off base.
So do you think with Route 66 and the Kingman Army Airfield, when it was in operation being here, that actually was a big jump start for the city or town of Kingman itself as far as economics goes, and there was a lot of people that were in support services for the base that stayed here all the time. They didn't just train as gunners and move on. There was a hospital and dentist. And hold on 1 second.
Okay.
Yeah. Oh, hold on a second.
Hello? Hey, doing fine, you?
So we're talking with Rob Chilcote of the Kingman Army Airfield Museum. He's taking a call right now. The museum's usually not open on a Sunday, but we decided to leave the phones open and stuff in case we had technical problems with the show. When you come down to the airfield, they give out flyers. It's got a Bugs Bunny carrying a .50 caliber machine gun and a B-17 flying over. It's located at 4540 Flight Line Drive. You actually come out to the Kingman Airport. And the director at this time is Bob Luce. He's here usually all the time, and you can talk to him. There's a phone number for the museum of 928-757-1892. There's a lot to see out here. There's airplanes, helicopters, vehicles. They have they have a room in the back where you can go back there, and they have a lot of artifacts and stuff that they have. There's also just a lot of historical stuff that's here. It may not all be from the gunnery school, but it's part of military history. They have a lot of photographs. They have a gift shop where you can actually purchase photographs, and you can purchase patches and things from the gunnery school. He was talking before he got the phone call about the Lone Ranger, Clayton Moore, being out here. Did you want to continue with that story?
Yes. After he was trained here, I think because of his celebrity, he went out and tried to recruit other gunners. So that's basically why he went through the gunnery training. Now, other celebrities did the same thing. They would become pilots, or they would pick something that they could talk about that they were interested in. The Air Force would give them that opportunity. So that's why Clayton Moore went through here.
Do you know anything about what they called the Kingman Army Airfield Operations Room? What was that all about out here?
Well, the operations room would be like the base headquarters, and the base headquarters would be just a little bit away from the tower. You know where you drove in from, which is now the Mojave County Drive? You know, the main road coming into the airport?
Yeah.
Well, that's where when you get up to about the time you make the right-hand turn to come on Olympic to our place, that's where the base headquarters used to be.
And as far as the support services, we were talking a little bit about that, the hospital, dentist, clerical, transportation. There was probably taxis that took people to and from the gunnery school. Is there a lot of people left in Kingman itself that were part of the gunnery school?
There were civilian employees out here. One of the best known was Logus, and he was coming out with a friend, and he ended up staying here because something happened with his friend. And then he eventually just stayed, and he bought a home just right across on 66, raised his family here. Most of his kids have lived here, and a couple of them already. Okay. Now, one of the guys that I know about, I've met him, is Bill Friday. He was stationed here all the way through the war. He was also part of the salvage days after the war, and he ended up building a construction company here. And today his son's on that construction company.
So Kingman itself today is, I think the population is somewhere around 35,000, and it's the county seat of Mojave County. Right?
Yeah. The Kingman's been the county seat since probably the late 1800s, early 1890s, because there was a vote for it. And, yeah, I would say there's about 40,000 people in Kingman now, because Kingman's always growing. And so there's that.
Okay, so when an actual cadet showed up here for the gunnery school, they'd already been in the Army for a little bit of time, right? This wasn't basic training or anything like that. This was just another part of their training. They decided to get into gunnery school, and they were stationed out here. Is that how that worked?
Excuse me. Yeah, once they were inducted, they would have to go through like an 8 or 6 week course of basic training, and then they would get their orders and they would come here. So, like I said, there was only like 10 or 15, 20 for each class when they first started out. So when you get into late 43, you got 200 to 300 guys being trained. So there's more people coming, and it stayed that way through 44, and 45 things started tapering off. And after Europe surrendered in May of 45, things started changing, and the talk was trying to keep Kingman Army Airfield open, but the military pretty much has decided that they're going to close this facility.
36,000 gunners that trained here is a pretty big part of history, and the thousands of planes that went through here and all the planes that they flew on. I'm sure over in the European theater, when you'd see someone from one of the early classes and you were in one of the later classes, that it was pretty exciting to see someone that had flown so many missions and you were just starting out on your missions. What do you think, as a cadet showing up at the gunnery school, what do you think they were excited about? Which class do you think they were excited about most? Maybe firing the 50 caliber machine gun, or I know that probably the oxygen chamber was a little scary to go through that.
I would say, yeah, the oxygen chamber would be kind of scary, but if most guys were raised on the farm, they knew how to use a shotgun, they knew how to use a 22. But yeah, I think the 50 cal would actually be kind of excited for them to do that, because that's a high power weapon, and there's a lot around through there, more than a shotgun one time.
So do you guys have reunions here for the old, how many of the 36,000 gunners do you think are left and still around the United States, or showing up to reunions or anything here?
Well, back in the 90s, we were holding the reunions. I think the biggest crowd we had was maybe 40. And I would say a good portion of them, maybe half of them, a little over half of them, were the actual students that went through here. And then, like I said, I met the gentleman a couple weeks ago where he was an actual instructor here in 44 and 45. So if they're still alive, I'm going to say out of that 36,000, there could be maybe just 100 left.
And do you guys have any reunions planned or any big events planned for the museum itself, or for the gunners in the future, or is it you're still in the, since you've just taken over, you're still in the planning stages?
Well, I don't think we'll see a reunion per se. I think that time has come and gone. So whoever shows up and says they used to be out here will do a nice handshake and tell them thank you for their service. But as for other activities of the museum, I think I'm looking at trying to do a few things and see what happens with them. Since I've been with the museum, I've been trying to get more out in the public so people know about it. Because I have an event going on, and it says, or anybody says that he didn't even know it was happening. So I think what I'm trying to do is rise the image of the Airfield Museum a little bit higher so that people know about it.
Yeah, I've talked to a few people, and they don't even know where Kingman is, let alone the Army Airfield that's out here. But being part of Route 66 and all the nostalgia and patriotism and things that are going on and parades, I know they just had a parade yesterday in Kingman for Andy Devine, and
right.
They probably got a few other things going around Kingman. It's not a real big town, but it does have a little bit of history to it. It's about 20 minutes to the east of Laughlin, Nevada, which has a lot of casinos and a lot of visitors through there. It's a 20-minute drive to the Kingman Army Airfield Museum if you're ever in Laughlin and you want to see part of history and some of the old World War II things. And like he says, he has a lot of vehicles and stuff from other wars, not just World War II. So it'd be a good thing the whole family could take part in being a part of the museum. You could come down here and spend 3-4 hours. They have a lot of restaurants and hotels in Kingman. Is there anything else about Kingman that you want to tell people? We have about 5 minutes left.
Well, Kingman's a nice, quiet town. hasn't become the big city like some people thought it would be, but that's fine. But we did have a nice growth spurt just before the recession hit. And chances are after the Hoover Dam bypass is completed, probably see a lot more people moving to Kingman because they're probably tired of Vegas. And we'll only be an hour and a half away from Vegas. So I think there will be a lot of people moving in from there. But I've been saying that for the last 10 years, so it looks like it might happen more. Kingman has great history. Like I said before, it started out a rail town. The ranches aren't around like they used to be. The line curves are a lot less than what it used to be. So Kingman is a town that's looking for new opportunities to grow.
And if you want to see part of history, you could come out to the Kingman Army Airfield Museum. Are there any other museums here in town?
Yes, there's one downtown, which is the Mojave Museum, History and Arts. Also, over in the Powerhouse, there's Route 66 Museum. Besides that, we do have one home where you can actually walk through, and it's one of the older families. It's the Benelli House, and it's a gorgeous home. And the best way to do it is talk to the people at the Mojave Museum, because they're the ones that operate it for the city.
And the weather's usually always nice up here. It doesn't really snow or anything. They have a lot of people on bike tours and things, motorcycles that travel Route 66. This is the original Route 66, right?
Yes.
And it'd be a good place to stop in. You could even have lunch or something, right outside. They don't offer any food here, but it's a real nice museum, and there's a lot here to see. The people here are real knowledgeable. I think Bob Luce, the director, I think he was in the Korean War, and he has a lot to talk about. And do you spend a lot of time here, Rob?
Yeah. Actually, I've been here almost the last 3 days. I worked the museum Friday, and I did half a day yesterday, and then I'm here doing the interview.
Okay, so we've been broadcasting live from the Kingman Army Airfield Museum. You can look it up online, or you can go to http://main.kingman.aafhsmuseum.org. We'll have a link up on Prepared Times Magazine, and we're also going to be rebroadcasting tonight on Dr. Pepper. So we thank everybody for showing up today, and have a nice day from Kingman, Arizona, Army Airfield Museum. Go ahead, Nate.
All right, thank you, and thank you for the interview.
All right, thank you.